So I want to talk a little bit about solitude. The spiritual discipline of solitude. For centuries, Christians have practiced being alone for a specific reason, not just because of our personality type, but for the spiritual health and benefits that come from it. Let's look over in Luke chapter 5. Jesus was one who practiced solitude. Verse 16, a very simple verse, but one that I think sets sort of the landscape of how we understand who Jesus was. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And this comes in the context of healing people of their sicknesses, of being around crowds of people. Maybe Jesus was an introvert too. Maybe it was just his spiritual power leaving him, like the bleeding woman. It's hard to say exactly all that's going on, but we know that his practice was that he would often withdraw to lonely places and he would pray. Mark 1, verse 35 says that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Luke 4:42, at daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place. The people were looking for him, and when they came to where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. He was retreated, got found, and then tried to retreat again. And there is a consistent theme of when Jesus even retreated. It was often at daybreak in the morning while it was still dark. Presumably, we would assume that this is when it's easiest to get away from people, when they're all asleep. But it comes at great sacrifice. So, what exactly is the spiritual discipline of solitude? It's not just being alone, though it includes that. I love Foster where he says that Jesus calls us from loneliness to solitude. The spiritual discipline of solitude is not just being alone. It's not just loneliness, right? We all know that we can be alone in a crowd full of people. We can feel lonely even with people right next to us. That's not spiritual solitude. Solitude's not about loneliness. Jesus calls us out of loneliness and into a genuine solitude. If we possess this solitude, a spiritual solitude, we don't fear being alone, for we know that we are never alone. Nor do we fear being with others, because we know they don't control us. Solitude allows us to move in and out of being alone and being with people seamlessly because we're centered, we're rooted, knowing and believing that we're never alone and that we fear no judgment of people, but only the judgment of God. And so the purpose of the classic discipline of spiritual solitude is about hearing. It's about refraining from talking. It's about removing ourselves from the noise and busyness and distractions of life in order to be able to hear from God. That was my intention, getting out into the wilderness and the woods. I wanted to be able to hear from God and myself more clearly. So if we're getting alone, if we're trying to refrain from talking, if we're trying to be silent, silence and solitude are often disciplines that go together, but we're doing it without a heart to really listen to God, we're not partaking in this classic spiritual discipline of silence and solitude. Instead, it's just like we're trying to not talk. It's almost like, I remember there was a fighter once that talked about his monastic journey, and he went out to the Far East. I believe he was in Thailand, I don't remember. And for a month, he lived with monks and didn't speak for a month. And he had had a really intense life. He was an Irish guy. And he said that was the hardest thing he had ever done in his entire life. And he was a professional fighter. To not talk for a month. But that isn't Christian solitude. Christian solitude isn't just the discipline of not talking or being alone. Rather, it's something where we are intentionally trying to make our antenna bigger, to hear, to receive, to be open to where God is leading, to what He is saying. It's not just about, again, emptying ourselves like Eastern meditation that we discussed last week, but about filling ourselves with God. So what are some dangers of solitude? Bonhoeffer, who wrote his classic, both Life Together as well as The Cost of Discipleship, in Life Together, a book about Christian fellowship, I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. He says, "Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Both solitude and fellowship by itself has profound pitfalls and perils. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings. And one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair." Did you catch that? For those of us that really like being alone, he says, watch out, because that can seep you into this abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair. We become so inward that it unravels us. And for those of us that don't like being alone because we only want to be around other people, he says, be careful, because it plunges us into the void of words and feelings. So Bonhoeffer is trying to communicate this tension, right, of solitude and fellowship, and that really they need each other. And depending on our personality and experiences and nature and nurture and all these things, we're going to kind of like lean probably towards one side of the spectrum than the other. But we've got to keep trying to become like Jesus, who was with crowds and yet retreated. Would be retreated and yet would be sucked back into the crowds and was in a place where he could really give of himself. That is the purpose of spiritual solitude and silence, to allow us to experience God, to become more like Jesus, so that we can then be in a place to give of ourselves. Even Jesus had to often withdraw to lonely places. So two things here that I wanted to bring up with solitude, and then we're going to end with like a challenge. I hope that you guys enjoyed your meditation this week with yourself and also with someone else. Last week I gave the challenge to try to practice a meditation both by yourself and with someone else. My wife and I got to do it one night after putting the boys down. It was oddly warm, and so we went out and sat on the porch, and we used this app to guide us through a meditation together. It was really, really cool. It was probably the most relaxed I've been in a while, actually, but I won't mention that anymore. So, balance. I want to talk about this idea of balance when it comes to solitude. Like Jesus, we must go away from people so that we can be truly present when we are with people. The fruit of solitude is increased sensitivity and compassion for other people. Solitude isn't just selfishness. It's not just about getting away from annoying people, though they are often annoying, and if we're honest, so are we. But rather, the purpose of Christian solitude is to help us be more fully present when we are with people, because we have communed with God, and we embody His heart for people. We learn to love and to have compassion and to see others as He does when we are alone with Him. I thought it was interesting that speech in a couple of these different disciplines have intersected in ways that I hadn't thought of before. In my mind, I'm like, what does silence and solitude have to do with speech? Foster and others make a great observation in that when we learn to be silent, it helps us to moderate our speech when we're with others. Some of us, let's be honest, we just like to talk too much. And we end up saying things that aren't that great, right? And so Jesus' brother, James, in his letter, says that the tongue is like a flame of great evil, that it can set a forest fire ablaze. Our speech has great power, both for good and for detriment. Solitude has an impact on our speech. Our tongue is perhaps our most powerful weapon of manipulation. A frantic stream of words flow from us because we are in a constant process of adjusting what other people think of us. This is very similar to what Michael shared. Some of us want to be alone so we're not constantly having to figure out how to be for other people. Solitude allows us to be who we are before God and confident in that, so that when we step before other image bearers of God and other human beings, we are speaking from a place not of trying to adjust our self-image and get other people to like us, but from a place of confidence and solidarity with truth and with love. And so it helps us to say less and mean what we say when we say it. For as Jesus warned us, anything more than yes or no is from the evil one. Thomas à Kempis, another monastic Christian around the 14th century, said it's easier to be silent altogether than to speak with moderation. A writer in the Proverbs said something very similar thousands of years before. He said, even a fool seems wise when he keeps his mouth shut. I have meditated on that proverb a lot. My wife would say I need to meditate on it a bit more. I'm sorry, honey. I don't remember that one quite as much as I need to when I'm with you. Even a fool seems wise if he keeps his mouth shut. So solitude, the practice, the intentionality of withdrawing in order to listen and hear and to stop speaking, empowers us to become more like Jesus in that we can hear from and understand God, so that when we step back into the realm of people and we're around others, it enables us to be more authentic, to be more true, to not be concerned what other people think, but to speak truthfully, to speak wisely, to not have to utilize words to protect ourselves, because we believe in the one who has already redeemed us. So what I want to do as we're going to close out here, I want to give you a charge, an encouragement, a challenge. At some point, let's say over the next month, because, we'll have to finagle the schedules and stuff, but find a time, if you can, for a day. Even if it's just the business day, 12 hours. If you can do 24 hours, great. Find a time to retreat, to have solitude. Maybe you have to start with just, hey, I'm going to find 30 minutes in a closet in my house. I'm going to go to the garage. I don't know, though. We live in Asheville. There's a lot of solitude around here. You don't have to walk very far. You don't have to drive very far to get really remote from people. I think that's why people like coming here, right? There's a culture here of really wanting to be alone. But as Christians, let's make sure we're utilizing being alone for the right purposes, not just for selfishness, because we like being alone, but rather for the purposes of transformation, to become more like Jesus, to be able to be with people from a place of greater love and compassion, of greater patience and endurance, and so that we can know ourselves better, right? As was discussed earlier, one of the great benefits of being alone is that it gives us an opportunity to even reflect upon ourselves, where we've been, where we are, where we're going, and why. Sometimes we need to create space to consider, to think, to pray, to wrestle, just as Jesus did. So, in the coming weeks, we'll take some time to kind of talk about and discuss how our solitude has been, what we've learned, what went well, what was challenging, what was terrible. I remember one brother telling me once, he was in seminary, and they part of seminary is they force you to do these things. It's a part of your curriculum. You have to have 24-hour silent retreats and stuff. And he said he went to this like monastery to do his 24-hour silent retreat, and he said, I spent 3 hours praying for everything I could possibly think of. And he said, I literally ran out of things to pray. I couldn't think what to do. I couldn't talk. So I just took a nap. He said it was the best nap of my life. And he said, and it clicked. The idea of doing nothing scares me because there's this deep desire to be productive. This was just this particular guy's experience, right? And so for him, being alone, being silent, it unlocks some things about himself that he wouldn't have necessarily had the opportunity to hear and see otherwise. I'm looking forward to this. Hopefully that's not just the introvert in me saying that. Some of you may be dreading this, but let's start somewhere, and let's start for the purposes of becoming more like Jesus. Let's pray together.